My name is Cynthia Rich. I am the manager of training here at GitHub, and my role is really working with organizations across the world to understand how best to get started, to set up, and to continue to use GitHub. So over the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the tips that we share with managers. Now, this is based on really kind of from a manager's perspective, we're really looking at a team lead / team manager role, not the exec level. The exec level might be a different discussion we'll have on another day, but we recognize that a lot of team leads and folks come in and just have very specific questions about how they can set up patterns within their teams. So this, we're going to spend about 40 minutes going through some materials on the recommendations that we typically like to make, and then more importantly, the things that we do ourselves to develop these workflows. At the end of that 40 minutes, we will allow some time for questions and answers. Now, if you have questions, I'm going to ask you to put those in the GoToWebinar Q&A panel. So there should be, in the control panel, there should be a little section down there called questions. You can enter your question there. I will answer those, though, at the end of class today. So rather than stopping in the middle of the presentation to answer the Q&A, I will come back to those and answer all of them at the end. And then a couple of other logistics things. Yes, we are recording this session. It will be sent out via email after the presentation. Of course, you have to be here live to get your questions answered. Kind of. We also will take additional questions at services@github.com if you have them after the day of the webcast. Because if you're anything like me, you go home and realize, I should have asked that question. So our goals for today, as I mentioned before, this was also, of course, in the invite when you signed up for this session. We're going to focus on how we manage teams that are working in GitHub. This includes how we set up organizations and teams, how we design our workflows, how we measure success, and how we build a collaborative culture. Now, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to skip in here are the things that probably you might feel are common sense. So we didn't want to spend too much time covering things that you already knew. We really wanted to focus in on those things that are specific to setting your team up for success in GitHub. So let's jump into it. We're going to start with organization and team structure. Now, this is always a really interesting topic. There's a lot of folks that will come ask me, how many organizations should we have within our, how many organizations should we own? And well, the answer is enough, but not too many. So let's just take this at a really high level. And I want to talk about how we think about organizing. And when we say organizing into organizations, an organization, of course, being an entity on GitHub. So I'm going to just assume a little bit of GitHub knowledge here, and that is that there are two types of accounts. There are individual accounts and there are organization accounts. There's also different types of these organization accounts, but the idea is that there's two different structures. One is the individual account, which is really designed for individuals like you and I. We create this account. We can own repositories. We can make changes to the repositories. We can be collaborators in other repositories because we have this individual account. And more importantly, we can be members of teams and organizations. So with the organization account type then is a little bit different, and then an organization isn't a single individual, right? An organization can have multiple people who are able to go in and administer that organization, to make changes to it, add people, remove people, and so on. So when we think about how we organize our teams, we're really thinking at this organization level. Now, how many organizations should you have? We really try to do the bulk of our work in a single organization. And the reason for that is this. Within that organization, we have the ability to create teams. Teams give us the ability to control permissions across a large number of projects, a large number of repositories all at once. If we create too many organizations and we have to manage the permissions separately in those organizations, as I'm sure you can guess, that can become cumbersome very, very quickly. So the way we think about it is everything that's owned as part of GitHub. So GitHub is what I'm referring to there. Every employee of GitHub is a member of that organization. They're a member of a team called All Employees. But then each individual may be members of other teams as well. So we have department specific teams. And when I say department specific, we have a finance team, we have an HR team, we have engineering teams, we have product engineering compared to platform engineering. Right? So all of these are considered department teams that more closely reflect probably our org structure than anything else. Below that are the project teams. Now, a project team is, of course, a matrixed team, so typically filled with cross-functional individuals, people who are contributing to multiple projects, and those usually have fun names so that the project team can identify themselves. We also have down here 3 other special types of teams. These teams are interesting to us because of how we use issues. So we use issues as our primary means of communication at GitHub. So even though folks will receive those issues via email, maybe they'll get them through the web notifications. Some people like to use Jasper. There's all different types of methods that we can use to review these notifications. But the idea is that we have some teams that are set up just so that people of like mind or like heart can join together or can come together to work on projects. So those things would be things like the location team. So we might have one that's for our offices in San Francisco and Boulder. We might have one that is for North Carolina, which is where I live. So those are the location teams. We have special interest teams. Special interest teams are folks who are interested in learning about specific projects or might be interested in cross-functionally working on a small project that isn't a long-term project or it doesn't make it to that project bracket. A special interest group may just be people who are interested in volunteering opportunities. So those are all special interest. And then, of course, affinity groups, Latinos, Blacks. We have, let's see, a women's group. We have women's tech group. We have all sorts of different affinity groups that you can join within GitHub. Now, the cool thing about these teams is that once someone's a member of the team within GitHub, they can request access into these other teams. So you don't have to fill out a questionnaire on day one when you join the company and say, which affinity groups would you like to be a part of? Instead, you're pointed to these affinity groups and you can request to join those groups, and then other members of the team can accept that request. So that's our main organization, GitHub, and the bulk of our work happens there. But that's not the only organization that we have. We also have several other organizations. Those organizations are related to open source projects. So GitHub does have some open source repositories. If you go there, you will see some repositories listed there that are not private. Those repositories are open source projects that GitHub maintains. However, when it comes to the point where we want to be able to add outside collaborators, or we want to be able to add folks who aren't a member of the GitHub organization to these projects, then we set them up as a separate organization that can maintain its own permission collaborator, contributor, administration, maintainer structure separate from GitHub. And examples of these are Atom, Electron, Desktop. These are all large open source projects that have many members in them. Now, if you wanted to join one of these organizations as a GitHub employee, then just like everyone else in the world that wants to join those organizations, we submit a membership request in order to be able to access those orgs. But those orgs are handled separately. They're handled by typically a community moderator that makes sure that those organizations are maintained. So when you look at how we structure organizations at GitHub, we really try to stay within this one large org. And that's for a lot of reasons that you've probably discovered already. It is discoverability of projects. So it's me being able to go out and see what projects already exist within the organization. It's me being able to reach out and see what projects I might be able to help with. It's also that team app mention, the ability to specifically mention teams and pull them into a conversation as compared to having to remember the name of every single individual on that team in order to pull them in. So that's just a little bit about how we think about organizations. It's probably one of the number one questions I get from folks who are setting up GitHub is how should we craft our organizations? And my answer is always as few as possible, but make sure that you have some clear thought process into why you're separating it into a different organization. And for us, that clear line is typically large open source projects where we want to be able to pull in collaborators who are not GitHub employees. Is where we'll separate into a separate organization. All right, so that is organizations. So now that we've got our organizations out of the way, let's talk a little bit about workflows. Now, most of you have probably seen this diagram at some point in time if you've taken another class with us. And this is the GitHub workflow. The thing that's interesting about this workflow, the other questions that we get all the time, is this workflow really viable for huge projects, ones where there's hundreds of people collaborating on that single project? And the answer is yes. The challenge comes in when we make our workflows so complicated that it's hard for people to follow. You know, there are workflows out there who are there are workflows out there who literally the workflow is so complicated that you have to create tools in order to enforce the workflow or just to make sure that the workflow is being followed. Every workflow, though, is some piece of this workflow is included. So even in those more complex workflows, we're following this same general flow, which is a branching workflow. Now, if you've come from another version control system, branching, trunks, these words all mean different things to you. But the idea is with Git, we want to maintain that one single branch that is our canonical branch. So in other words, for us, represented by this kind of heavier but light blue line up here, that represents master for us. Master can be anything you want it to be. And this is another thing as a decision as a manager you'll want to make is what should we call our production branch, the canonical branch that it matches what's currently delivered out into the world. That branch is one that we should absolutely have protected. And I'm going to show you branch protections in just a few minutes after we get through kind of working through this. But from a manager's perspective, what you're really interested in is keeping master pristine. Nothing should ever be merged to master that has not already been tested. We also should already know that all of master is in the branch that we're merging in so that we can check that against those tests. So we want to make sure that anything that makes it into master, we know for sure it's going to work. And the reason for that is quite simply this. One day you're working along, you push out a branch, you push out a new feature, things go south, you need to quickly yank that back. It's much quicker to just flip the switch and deploy and look back at master than it is to revert that change, pull it back out, and redeploy master. So just trying to keep that workflow simple. If we need to flip the switch to go back to a safe place, making sure that master is always safe is the way to do that. So whenever we're developing new features, we're going to create a branch. Now, branches in Git are lightweight. They're meant to be created and then torn down on a regular basis. So you should not, we don't want to try to put limits on the number of branches that we create. However, as a manager, the one thing that we do want to do is we want to empower our developers to work on branches together. I've gone to a couple of conversations where folks were, a branch belonged to an individual. And if I needed to make changes or I wanted to contribute changes to that branch, I branched off of their branch. It was really confusing. And that can get messy in a hurry. If I mess up my merge head on that branch from their branch, I can accidentally merge changes into master that shouldn't be there. So we really want to be careful about the communication and the expectations that we set with our teams in that these branches are meant to represent features where multiple people will be working together. All right, so we create a branch. Typically, that branch will relate to a feature or a bug fix. And then on that branch, we make commits. Now, as I mentioned, these commits can be from more than one author. So while the workflow looks like an isolated singular activity, it is meant to be a collaborative activity within this branch. I create a couple of commits. I open a pull request. Now, here is manager tip number 2. Manager tip number 1 was organizations. Manager tip number 2. Work with your teams to get these pull requests open early. And when I say early, if you're using test-driven development, as soon as they write the test, they should have the pull request open. If you're using any other method of testing, if you're not testing yet, of course, you'll want to be testing in the future, but if you're not testing yet, then once I've made 1 or 2 commits so that you can see the direction that I'm heading or what I'm trying to accomplish, I should open a pull request. We've even, quite honestly, opened pull requests before where we didn't really know for sure which direction we were going to go with the solution, but we just wanted to signify that we were working on a specific problem. And so we opened the pull request after literally placing a comment in the code saying, here's what we're going to accomplish in the code. But opening the pull request early allows your other team members to know what's happening. It allows your team members to coach each other, to help detect issues earlier, to help recognize conflicts with perhaps conflicting feature development that's happening. So all of these things happen because we open the pull request early and we start having the conversation about the change. So we're going to open our pull request. Lots of magic happens inside the pull request. So within the pull request, we're going to have a discussion. We're going to do some code review. All right. Code review, I'm going to show you all in just a minute this process going from beginning to end. And I want to specifically just spend a couple of minutes on code review so that you can see how code review works in the project. But once we have gotten this particular feature to a good place, we know we're ready to merge this feature back into our master branch. There's one last step here. And if you've looked at this diagram before, the squirrel here, our little ship it squirrel, represents the deploy step. Now, you're probably saying, why is that deploy step before the merge to master? And that's an excellent question. This is based on how we at GitHub deploy. So we at GitHub, for our .com product, deploy directly from the feature branch. So we'll put everybody in the deploy queue. When it's their turn in the deploy queue, their branch will deploy to out to production. And then as long as everything tests and works fine, then that branch is merged into master. Now that is because of that simple reason that I told you earlier. It's just a lot easier to flip a switch and put us back to master than it is to extract a broken build and then redeploy master. So we do that for a reason, to make sure everything's okay before that code is deployed into master. Now, interesting statistic that I saw someone pull up in a single month, because of the fact that we are using continuous integration, we are constantly merging these branches into master, constantly adding new features, fixing bugs, and so on. Because of that, the master branch for GitHub was only live on the site for literally like 38 minutes. It's crazy, an entire month. So that's how continuously we are shipping these new branches, merging them in, shipping the next branch, merging them in. So, and that's, continuous integration, of course, being the art, I like to call it an art, of crafting these small incremental changes that will be frequently merged into master, which of course allows everyone else to develop at a quicker pace as well, because they're continuously getting your changes and able to pull those into their branch. All right, so once we have deployed, everything looks good, then our last step is to merge the branch. Now, when I merge, again, I'm not teaching a Git class to you right now. So basic things here, when I merge, of course, my changes become a part of master and forever available in production. All right, so that's the core workflow. Now, we've seen a lot of variations to this, some good, some not as good. So some things that we see often are a lot of folks don't want their team members to merge directly into master. So instead, they'll create this secondary long-running branch called develop or something along those lines. Everybody will merge from develop and then merge back, everybody will branch from develop and then merge back into develop, but master is kept separate. It's in this separate space, isolated from the develop branch, and only one person on the team has the ability to merge that code from the develop branch into master. We've also seen teams who use a forking workflow. So if you're not familiar with forks on GitHub, a fork is basically creating a copy of the repository that lives on an individual's account or on a separate organization's account that is wholly separate. It's a static copy of the repository from the parent repository. Now, using forks is very, very common in open source. And there's really no way to get around it in open source. It's used for people who are not collaborators on a repository to be able to make contributions to that repository. And we've even seen organizations use this fork and pull workflow for their inner source projects. The key, though, with fork and pull is if you're using it because you don't want to add, or you won't add people as collaborators because they're external contributors, that's fine. That makes a lot of sense. But within an organization, we really want to give our developers the power to go in and make these changes with as little friction as possible. Because less friction means that people are more likely to contribute that quick change that they saw, that quick typo, right? If I have to go in and fix a typo and you tell me I have to fork the repository in order to fix the typo, I'm probably just going to drop it in an issue, or better yet, I might just even say, you know what, I'm going to get that to that tomorrow. And about tomorrow never comes sometimes. So we want to make sure that we reduce all of the friction we can to allow people to contribute to our repositories. All right, so with that, I want to jump over to an example, and I want to show you branch protection, because I think this is a good example that will hopefully help you to see how this workflow can work. Now, I've created just a sample repository here that we can use for today's activity. And in my sample repository, I'm going to go ahead and create a pull request. So I'm going to jump in here. There's no open pull request, as you can see. I need to make a change first. So I'm going to go down here in the posts folder. I'll grab this picture. I'm going to edit. All right, I'll add a caption. And now you can see down here, I have the opportunity to go ahead and create a branch and propose those file changes. All right, so this is just me opening a pull request. Again, not necessarily a class on GitHub Flow. If you're interested in a class on GitHub Flow, let me know at the end of class and I can get you to a good resource for that. But let's just talk a little bit about the pull request now, because the pull request is really where you as a manager can help your team to be more effective. One of the worst things that we can do is we create terrible pull requests to go with our terrible caption and basically just create this blank thing. Somebody else will figure out what I'm looking at, or if they want to know what I'm looking at, just go look at the code, right? If they want to know what I'm doing, go read my code. So we want to make sure that when folks are opening pull requests, and the same holds true for issues as well, that they're really enforcing a collaborative workflow, or they are keeping this collaboration in mind as they do so. Because to be honest with you, if you're not intentional about it, it's just not going to happen. So we want to go ahead and let's do a better title here. All right. And now within this pull request, I'm going to do a few things. So a couple of things I'm going to do, I'm just going to let you know, hey, with a little TLDR, right, here's a basic overview, and I might put in here some app mentions. So I might say, hey, GitHub School Training Team. Here's my team app mention, right? So now I can mention all the members of that team. Incidentally, if you want to know who the members of that team are, you can always go to the preview here and hover over that tag, and it'll show you all of the members of that particular team. So that's one good way to see who's in a team without having to go back to the org and see it. All right, so I can @ mention a team. I could also @ mention individuals here if I want to. I can also cross-link, so I can say this closes number 1, activity 1. So these cross-links are interesting because by using the magic word here, closes, there's 3 magic words, by the way, is closes, fixes, and resolves. Those magic words will when I merge this pull request, it will automatically close the associated issue, which is a pretty clever way to keep up with making sure issues stay fresh, right? The last thing we want is to have 1,000 issues and half of them are done. Who knows what needs to still have work done on it? So issue maintenance is a constant, I don't want to say struggle, but it's a constant task that we have to think about. And so just by having the pull request close that original issue, you can make that job a little bit easier. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create my pull request. Now you're going to see I have a couple of things, like instantly my pull request just turned completely red. And the reason my pull request turned completely red is because I have branch protections set up on this repository. And we're going to look at those branch protections in just a second. The last thing I want to do though is I want to go over here and I want to take a look at some of these other options over here on the side. First things first, you probably noticed reviewers, GitHub Teacher has already been requested as a reviewer. And the reason for that is GitHub Teacher is a code owner. What a code owner means is in GitHub, you can assign people who are owners of specific subsets of the code. So for example, GitHub Teacher owns everything that lives in the posts directory of this repository. So anytime somebody changes a file that lives inside the posts directory, GitHub Teacher is automatically going to be requested as a reviewer for this repository. All right, I'm going to show you code owners in just a second as well. I'm going to show you protected branches and code owners. So just bear with me for a second. Assignees are another way that we ensure that these issues and pull requests make it over the finish line. So the assignee is usually the person who at the end of the day is responsible for saying, yep, this should go in to, this is ready to be merged. All right, so that can be an assignee. You can also do that with the reviewer. However, the reviewer is typically going to be different than the assignee. As C-Rich ID, I can't also be a reviewer, right? So the assignee is really that person who is going to, at the end of the day, push the big green button to merge the pull request. So I'm going to go ahead and assign myself to this. Of course, I might assign another team member if it was primarily going to be in their realm. We also have labels. You're probably familiar with labels already. I'm just going to throw a quick label on here. We use labels a lot. Labels help us to really organize our work so that we can quickly filter to see whether maybe we have a bunch of labels that are good first patch in our open source repositories, for example. Things that are quick and easy to resolve. We also use labels to represent the stages in a project. So if a project is currently in development, if it's ready for QA, and so on. All right, so labels can help us to do those things. Projects allow us to add this to a project board. So I'm going to go ahead and just put this on. You notice when I click on projects, it comes up with recent repository and organization. So I can choose whether I want it to go to this class activity caption contest repository or project, or that maybe one at the organization level. You can see there's a couple at the organization level as well. I'm going to choose just one within this repository for the caption contest. And then the last thing down here is a milestone. Milestones allow us to also group activities together to represent kind of a concrete ship, if you will. So if I have multiple issues and pull requests and all of those need to be handled as part of one feature, then I would group those as a milestone. So I'm going to grab that. I'm just going to go ahead and add this to the milestone as well. All right, so lots of things happening in this pull request. It's literally attached to everything. And as I do that, you can see that it's adding all of these, right? It's adding all of these actions, all of these events to the timeline of my pull request. So I can see if I'm using labels to progress my project through certain steps that always have to happen, then that will be denoted in those labels when I've changed the label from enhancement to QA. And somebody can't come behind you and delete a label, right? There's no delete button on this. So somebody can't say, oh, nope, Cynthia never added that enhancement label to that, all right? So this is a pull request. I did actually Notice that the closes is underlined and highlighted here for me. It's telling me that this pull request is going to close issue number 2. That's because I put that magic closes before it. I also have a cross link here over to the actual issue. And you can see that next to, so here's the original comment in the issue where we said we're going to make some captions, and here's the pull request title, and notice that it has this little information icon here. That shows you that there's a relationship between the issue and the pull request, and it's going to let you know this little open will of course change to a merged tag when that pull request is merged. So all just little ways we can see how the work is progressing in the repository. So right now, everything is red. Yikes, let's fix that, or let's take a look at why. I'm going to show you protected branch settings real quick. So I'm going to jump over here to settings and to branches. And notice I have 2 options here. Default branch, this is of course just the base branch of your repository. Protected branches are what we want to look at. So I can actually protect any branch in my repository. Most people will absolutely protect master. By just the generic, nothing but protecting master will disable force pushes and prevent this branch from being deleted. Who wouldn't want that, right? So we don't want master to be accidentally deleted from someone or by someone. So we should go ahead and protect master, keep it from being deleted, as well as disable force pushes to the branch. What a force push is, if you're not familiar with Git, is a force push is basically a blunt overwrite of the history. And that we don't want that, especially on master. Usually the only time that happens intentionally is if somebody accidentally pushed some credentials up to the repository, or maybe if we're splitting this repository out into smaller pieces. So there's a few legit reasons for force pushes, in which case you would just have to come in and disable the protection long enough to do that. But by that time, you've had a conversation with the team, you know it's going to happen, you're ready for it, and it's an intentional action. Right? So below the branch protection, once I've enabled that very basic protection, there are some other options here. So let's take a look at these. The first is to require pull request reviews before merging. So in other words, it makes sure that someone has reviewed this before I can merge it. All right. There's some other options here. I won't read all of these to you. I know that you probably wouldn't remember if I did probably read all of these to you, but you can probably, they're pretty well documented or well explained here, I think, in the code, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about these in Q&A. So we want to require pull request reviews before merging. But down here, this is the piece that I think is particularly interesting to managers. So there is the capability with a pull request review to dismiss a pull request review. So in other words, Joe went on vacation. Before he went on vacation, he reviewed my pull request and requested changes. I don't want to have to wait until Joe comes back from vacation in order to merge this pull request. So you as a manager can set up a team or individuals, and these people will be the only ones that are allowed to dismiss pull request reviews. So in other words, I would have to talk to maybe a repository admin, or maybe it's yourself as a manager. I would have to talk to you in order to have that pull request review dismissed so that I could merge. All right. Another interesting thing about pull request reviews is that you have to have at least one approved, but you can't have any that are still requesting changes, right? So if anybody's requested changes, those have to be either flipped to approved, or they have to be dismissed in order to merge. All right. Some others, you can see there's a require review from code owners. So in other words, if I click this, it will say that if the code owner hasn't reviewed it, then of course we can't merge. Require status checks to pass before merging. This goes hand in hand with your CI tool. So your CI tool or other tools that pass things back to the status API. If you can designate which ones of those must be passing in order for you to merge the pull request. And it doesn't have to be all of them. So if you're running 10 tests on your repository and you really only care about 8 of them, maybe the other 2 are just linters or something that they're nice to have, but they're not showstoppers, right? So if that's the case, then you can designate which ones have to be passing before they can be merged. And then the last one down here is probably the most heavy-handed one. And this is basically restrict who can actually press the merge button. So in other words, the only people that can press the merge button right now are the organization and repository admins, GitHub teacher, and myself. Nobody else can push. Now, you can include administrators in these configured restrictions. So in other words, even an admin could not merge this if it didn't have any pull request reviews. So that's possible as well. I am, because I don't have anybody to review my pull request for me today, I'm going to go ahead and just uncheck that button that's requiring pull request reviews. I'll leave the second one checked though and save those changes. All right, let me grab my password. All right, here we go. So we'll save those changes, or everything's saved. We're all good. Let's go back to our pull request. All right, so from our pull request, I can see now that I've requested a review, but it's not required to merge. So I'd still like it if GitHub teacher would come in and look at it, but we haven't actually made this a requirement. So someone could merge without a pull request review. I have no conflicts. And of course, then I am ready to go ahead and merge. Before I merge this though, let's go over and talk about projects and milestones. So we talked about projects briefly when I added one to the list. And if you notice down here, I have just this one project. Now, projects in GitHub are meant to be very flexible, so you can create the columns to include only those things that you want, right? We don't enforce that you have to have certain column labels. Now, there is over here on the far right-hand side, notice there's a little highlight button here. It says there's one new card. That card is waiting to be triaged into the project. That, incidentally, is the card that's for my pull request. And you remember, I added it to the project in that pull request. So all that's doing is it's kind of set it aside here for me, and it's just waiting for me to drag it to the appropriate column in the project. So we're going to go ahead. This is in progress. So let's put that one in progress. I have some other projects or other cards over here. These are for issues. So let's go ahead. That one would be in progress, and you guys get the point that I can, of course, go through and move all of these around to the appropriate place just based on this. I can also add a card that's not associated with an issue. So let's just say, I can add that. And then the opposite is true as well. So if I want to, I can click the drop down here and I can open an issue from here as well. That will convert that to an issue. And now you can see if I click, then that issue will have been created over on the Issues tab. So they work in both directions with projects. Milestones, let's go look at our milestones. So we get to those from the Issues tab. We can click on milestones. And the neat thing about milestones is they will show you the number of opened and closed issues and pull requests associated with this particular milestone. They have due dates. They have usually a completion percentage, so you'll be able to see for those that have been closed. And of course, then I can edit this milestone, close it, or delete it once everything is all set up and done. So that's just a really high-level overview of some of the things that we can do in these workflows. So let me jump back over here to our presentation, the code owners file. So I mentioned that I had an example of the code owners. The code owners file example is also in the workflow example repository that we were just using. So if I jump back over to that for a second, on the code tab, there's a .github folder. The .github folder is going to contain anything that is a customization for your repository. So issue templates are one example. So every time someone opens an issue using the new issue button, it would be pre-populated with some text. We use this a lot for when we want to receive bug reports from folks. And then another code tab, the other one there is this code owners tab. This is actually from the help documentation that's on github.com. It's really, really good. But essentially the way it works is as you go down the file, the owners lowest on the file take precedence, right? So I'm overwriting the earlier owners with later entries. But the neat thing about this is versioned with the code. So as changes happen to the code, I can make the appropriate changes in the code owner's file, and it maintains the same version control as everything else, right? As compared to protected branches settings, I can go in and flip those settings on and off, and that's not recorded as part of code, but the code owner's is. All right, so that's code owners. And let's jump back over here. And let's talk just a little bit about how we customize our workflow. We already talked about issue templates just briefly there. I showed you the example while we were in our .github folder. So some other things that you can do to customize your workflow. We recognize that folks already maybe have tools that they know and love and want to use with their repositories. We also recognize that not everybody has the exact same needs in their repository. So I wouldn't want to force a process or a specific tool on you or a specific check that didn't feel right for your workflow. And so because of that, we work heavily with integrators who are building these world-class integrations to go into the GitHub platform. So some of the things that they do, and this was just a screenshot that I grabbed earlier today off of Marketplace, so you could have a nice recent one. But there are continuous integration tools, dependency management tools, code review, code quality, project management tools. There are all types of different tools that you can integrate into your GitHub instance, and you'll want to check these out to really customize your workflow. Another way to customize your workflow is Probot. Now, Probot's really cool. Probot is new. It is actually an open source project. It's not officially a GitHub project. It's a project that really took advantage of GitHub's balanced employee IP agreement, in that it allowed some employees at GitHub to have a great idea and to release it as an open source project, even though it could be right on that edge of what might be considered employer IP. And Probot is an example of that. So with Probot, you can set up apps that will allow you to automate your workflow. And I have a website that I'll show you in a little while, but there's already a bunch of apps that have been built on Probot. It's fairly new, but there's a bunch of apps already that allow you to extend GitHub and customize what people see as they go through the workflow in your repositories. So check Probot out. It's pretty interesting. Like I said, there's already some existing plugins. It's also really easy to build on top of it. And if none of that works for you and you still need more flexibility, then the other option is, of course, to use the GitHub API itself. We have two flavors of API. We have the REST API, which is our V3, as well as GraphQL API, which is newer, V4 released in May, I believe it was. All right. If you want some examples of scripts that people have written either via the API to use with GraphQL, pre-receive hooks, I believe there's some Git hooks in here as well. I'm skipping pages. There is an open source repository called GitHub/platform samples. And then this will be a place where you can go to get those very customized scripts and to tweak those so that you can use them in your repositories in your organization. All right. Some other really quick helpful tidbits. By the way, you'll get a copy of this slide deck after the presentation. So that's one of the reasons why I put these in here. I wouldn't expect you to copy these down. But one thing that we do is when someone lands on a README in one of our repositories and we want to be able to give them an easy way to create a new issue to report a bug, then we can go ahead and link to this new issues and pass some query parameters with that new issue so that it's less typing for the individual who's entering a bug report for us. And then another option down here is when you have long issues and pull requests with a lot of details, here's just a little helpful hint here. So these are just two of my favorite tips that I use quite often. These will be in the slide deck when you get it after the presentation. So we had a couple of useful patterns that we use within our organization to help us communicate better, to make sure the whole team knows what everybody's working on. Of course, we've already seen projects and milestones. We know how those can work. But one of the other things that we do is every week we do an async weekly update. This is probably more general stuff, just how we manage teams. There's a team overview. So we usually have in the top post of the issue the things that we expect to ship this week and who's out of office. And then we have each individual on the team goes through and does an individual post that talks about when they're available, what their focus is for this week, where they need help, and what they're learning. And then, of course, all of that leads to better collaboration across the team. All right, some other tips for issues and pull requests here. So we have, if you are writing an issue and pull request, we always talk about the TLDR. We want to have just a couple sentences up top that allow people to know exactly what we're trying to accomplish. And then we also typically indicate the scope of the ship. If it's a really small ship, a spelling change, a grammar change, oops, I messed that up, it's not calculating exactly like it should, then maybe it's just something that I need one person to review for me. If it's a more complex change, then I might ask for more reviewers. And this kind of goes along with the piece about requesting reviews. I can request reviews from 10 people, but maybe I only need one of those people to actually do the review before I can merge this. And that helps people to know, hey, they've already got one review. I don't need to review this one. Cross-references we talked about a little bit when we looked at the pull request that we opened earlier, but you can cross-reference both to individual issues as well as Markdown gives you the ability to create links as cross-references. Now, from a manager's perspective, if someone is opening an issue or a pull request, I expect to see cross-references to prior art. So in other words, I expect to see cross-references at the very minimum to an issue where it's been discussed or where the need was identified when they're creating the pull request. And that's just a way for us to make sure that we're tying all of the pieces together for our future selves when we go back and say, why did we do that again? This will help us find it. And then tasks lists are one last thing. And these are basically checklists. So the little checkable boxes here that we can create inside pull requests and issues. These, if you put these in the top post of the pull request or issue, they'll appear also in the list. So I can see that I have, 0 of 6 items completed, for example, in a particular issue. Project boards we talked about the fact that they're flexible. These were some of the project boards that I just grabbed out of different GitHub projects just within our organization. So you can see they're really all different. Each team sets up the project board to look exactly like they want it to. And then the last thing I just wanted to throw in here, when we talk about how we manage our teams, one of the things that's really important to us at GitHub is giving our folks an opportunity to contribute back to open source. We consume a lot of open source projects, we maintain open source projects, but we also want to make sure that for those projects that we're consuming, we're contributing back. And whether it's a bug fix, a new feature, an enhancement, contributing to documentation, any of the above, we encourage our team members to do this on a regular basis. One of the things that we just did was we launched this website, this Open Source Friday website that allows people to go in and they can track their contributions on Fridays via this Open Source Friday website. And it's a great way to gives people a lot of satisfaction to be able to contribute back a lot of employee happiness. And it doesn't have to be a lot of time. Just a couple hours on a Friday morning often is enough. All right, so with that, I want to jump over. Let's jump out of our slideshow, and I'm going to jump over to Q&A because I've seen some great questions coming in via Q&A. While I'm looking at Q&A, I'm just going to pop open a couple of websites for you here. This is GitHub Marketplace. So this is the one that I was recommending as far as looking at the integrations. Here's Probot as well. So let me pop up on Probot so you can look at Probot in all its glory. And I'm going to go check out the Q&A panel. All right. Will there be better management options for external contributors in the future? For example, only giving them access to issues or other parts of the repository. So the granularity of permissions in GitHub is something we're constantly evaluating. So I can't say for sure yes or no whether we're going to add anything in the immediate future, but I do know that it's something that we specifically look at on a regular basis. If you have a specific use case and you say, I want to use it for this particular scenario, email that to me at services@github.com, and there'll be a place where I can add that and get that over to the development team. Do you have the same advice for organizations and teams for GitHub Enterprise, namely for government organizations? It always depends. Government organizations are always a little bit interesting because typically you'll own one appliance but have multiple actual organizations working on it. So for us, an organization would be a member, a group of people working towards a shared goal. So if your government organization is sharing your enterprise instance with multiple smaller organizations, then probably each one of those would have their own organization on GitHub. It really comes down to permissions and team mentions. So if you think about it in terms of, we want to be able to manage permissions in the easiest way possible, but also we want to be able to make sure that people who are likely to work together can easily @mention each other within the org and as a team. So hopefully that helps with that question. How to follow Git diffs between commits after a heavy refactor. Even if commits are small, the amount of commits will be hard to follow. After a heavy refactor, let's see here. I think we're just talking about the Git diff view on the pull request. Can you help clarify that for me? I want to make sure I'm telling you the right thing. Okay, so yeah, we're just talking about the diff view. So there is within the diff, let me jump back over here and show this real quick. My pull request is probably not a great example of this, but one thing that you can notice is in the Files Change tab, you have the ability to jump to specific changes. So you can look for specific file changes that have happened. Mine is so small, it's not even illustrative at this point. But you can jump to specific changes that are happened. You can also jump to specific functions. So the jumping option is really helpful if you want to be able to look just at the changes in a specific section or a specific file. You can also notice over here changes from all commits, or I can view changes just from select commits that have been made. And again, mine's not a great example because I only have one commit, but that's another option for narrowing down the diff view. Because I agree, but I think the real key there is that if you're doing a heavy refactor, even for a heavy refactor, we don't do those all in one branch. So I would typically use multiple branches in that case that would have to be merged together. All right, tip 2 is a great idea. A lot of times changes pile up and it'd be helpful for advanced notice discussion while working through stuff, not after. Exactly. You're exactly correct. Is it possible to get the registration at the end? Okay. So I'm sorry. I just now saw the information about Zoom window resolution. Sorry about that. Too late, but hopefully that's better. All right, do we do manual QA? How does that work with the flow that you've shown? So QA typically, depending on your process for QA, and external teams that are handling QA compared to internal teams, we can deploy typically from a branch to a staging server, which is oftentimes where a lot of the QA will happen. So there's several different options. And let me see. Okay, documentation for the .github folder. All of the documentation for the .github folder is in the help docs. So if you search for Code Owners is a brand new feature that just was released. I will tell you this, if you want to stay up to date with new features that are coming out, the GitHub blog is the place to do that. So if we would typically announce these new features on the blog itself. So there's one that was just announced a couple of days ago. So inline comments in GitHub for Visual Studio. So there you go. Jenny linked to a list of best practices for government as well. So thank you for that, Jenny. Jenny is one of our very talented team members. And just in case you can't see that, I'm going to drop it in the chat window as well. All right, issues. Some people seem to like keep one issue open for everything related to it and seem to edit the issue as time goes on, while I prefer to close issues and reclarify new issues so tracking and progress isn't merged. Which strategy do you find most useful? I am all about very short issues. So one of the challenges with long issues is once they get long in the tooth, people just stop reading, or they stop reading the earlier posts, and so they lose context and aren't often able to contribute meaningfully to that issue. So I think shorter issues are better. Once they have more than 10 comments, I think people just zone them out. So we typically try to keep them concise and targeted, and then if there are things that come up within that issue that feels like it is if there are things that come up in that issue that seem like they are new projects or things that we need to be considered separately, then we will open a new issue for those things. Sorry, I was just looking at the notes for the government best practices link. I'll get you a different link in just a second. Sorry, I just realized I dropped you the back end link to the website and not the front end pretty link. That'll be helpful. Okay, and there's another one I've lost up here. Okay, another one. Coming from another industry, curious how many other PM tools are used other than GitHub? Is there an MS project schedule already developed with critical tasks and milestones pre-identified? Or is code so iterative it is more efficient to do and reevaluate as you're going? So great questions. The other communication tools that are useful, that's the easy one. We do use Slack. We actually have a wonderful Slack integration with GitHub and Hubot that allows us to really tie the two together. So if we're referencing a specific issue in our discussion in Slack, then there'll be a link dropped in the issue so that folks can see that there was a discussion happening in Slack about that issue. And if they want that context, they can click and quickly go to the archive in Slack to find that conversation. So we do use those as communication tools as well. As far as how many other PM tools are used other than GitHub, we find a lot of folks really love the integrations that we have with project management apps. So there's ZenHub, there's Waffle, there's a few different project management apps that you might want to consider in the marketplace there. I've heard they're all excellent, so I wouldn't recommend one over the other. You would just want to look and see which one meets your need. I know that there's many ways to manage projects. We're going to actually do the next webinar in this series is just on managing projects in GitHub. And we've usually defaulted to the simplest way is the best way. We don't want to overcomplicate projects so that the project in and of itself becomes a monster to be managed. And so we generally try to stay with the easiest solution possible. Now, of course, that varies based on what you're trying to accomplish, right? If it's a huge new feature, then you probably need a project roadmap and you need burn down charts and you need, right? Like there's different requirements based on the scope of the change. And we try to keep that in mind so that we don't want to put overkill on every single project. But at the same time, some projects do need that level of detail and planning, and absolutely we would do the same level of detail and planning for those. All right. So let me grab a link to that government site. I believe Hopefully I'm going to get this right. Yay, I found it. Okay, government.github.com. And here are, so your links that we dropped in there. Everything for government is here. And I'm going to drop this in chat window as well. So that link that we listed earlier about best practices, all of those tools end up on this site. So you should be able to find them here. And I'll try to, as soon as I finish answering questions, I'll try to find you a better one. You mentioned that when you deploy and later on merge, do you mean that you switch the entire github.com to that branch and switch back to master? So we deploy, and I think I mentioned this, the deploy queue will deploy directly from the branch, and then the branch is merged into master. But as I'm sure you can guess, with hundreds of people developing on the platform, all using this continuous integration and iterative development, that deploy queue is almost always full, right? So most of the time, GitHub is pointing to a branch, with the rare exception of either the queue finally all gets emptied, or for some reason we have to roll back to master. So yes, we do deploy from the branch and not from master. And incidentally, one question that didn't come up, but often is a question that folks have, is how does that compare to how we handle our enterprise product? So we do have the enterprise, the hosted product that you can have inside of your organization, which of course for government organizations, I'm sure that you're using it. And for that product, we do develop that product also out of the same repository, out of the same code base. And simply when it comes time, we cut a release branch basically and release the enterprise instance from there. And incidentally, for those that had the question about how we deploy, there's an excellent article. I just remembered this. I should have thought of this before, on our engineering blog. And I probably won't be able to find it fast. It's a couple years old at this point. But there is an excellent article on our engineering blog that talks about how we deploy GitHub.com. And I'll try to find that and drop it in the notes that we send after the class. All right. Thanks so much for everybody who's hung in. You had great questions, and I appreciate it. We are at the end of our time. I actually went a few minutes over, so I apologize for that. I'll stick around for a couple more minutes in case any other questions come in, but otherwise, thank you for joining. And if you don't have any other questions, then hope to see you at our next webinar.